Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Bobber Academy. This is episode 8, HIP74 with Boris. Hi, Boris. Welcome back.
Hi, Anne. Thank you. Good to be back.
Great. So I'm going to link the description of the HIP74 write-up in the show notes. But before I go into the questions, I'm going to give a very quick recap of what this HIP is about. Let me know if I got it right.
I'll keep you honest, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So as I understand, HIP74 is the first proposal that talks about POC rewards for the Helium mobile network. It introduces this modeled coverage concept, which will attempt to predict the coverage an indoor or an outdoor radio can provide to its surrounding area. And at the same time, it also introduces this very important new entity, which is the obstruction data oracle that will be used to calculate the rewards for indoor and outdoor radios.
Yes, I think that the summary is more or less accurate, and let me know if you want me to kind of go deeper on any of these concepts.
Yes, I would like to kind of ask for some elaboration, but maybe we can go with the feedback first, since this HIP has been out for a couple of weeks, and I wanted to know that have you been following with any of the community feedback so far? And based on the feedback, what do you think about the community's understanding of this HIP?
So there's been a lot of chatter. I definitely have been on top of it and actually, hopping into the channels and trying to engage with the community and, have productive conversations about some of the more relevant comments, at least about the HIP. I do think that at this point, most folks that are really interested in understanding were able to understand the HIP, and we did get quite a bit of a useful feedback. The main point, and that is the one that we've actually already addressed and published an updated version of the HIP, is the points rewarded for the indoor coverage. So the outdoor coverage, I think, is fairly straightforward. Everybody understood it. There were comments, around the periphery, why, how, etc. But I don't think there's a lot of argument. There's a lot of argument on the indoor radios because the data about, like what the buildings are built out of, and therefore our model for estimating the coverage is cruder. And I think that also community has rightfully pointed out that in the HIP that we proposed, just the sheer number of reward points earned by the indoor radios is sort of inadequately allocated when compared to outdoors. So we have taken that into the account, actually, and I think it was just a couple of days ago, updated the HIP. So with the new update, the indoor radios actually get significantly more reward points. We haven't changed the actual kind of like model for how the coverage is calculated, but the number of reward points has been increased to the point where I think there's not going to be a dramatic loss in rewards for the indoor radios as compared even to the Genesis period, at least initially, given, how we've kind of played around with the numbers. So
I see. So when you say there isn't going to be like a dramatic loss from how much the indoor radio is making now versus how much it's going to make post-Genesis, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So basically, I think it's important maybe to explain again, like the context. So initially, what we've decided with model coverage and proposed in the HIP as the first sort of, iteration of it, is that, we are dividing the entire world into resolution 12 hexes. We'll look at each hex, irrespective of it being indoor or outdoor. and look at how many radios are providing coverage in that hex. And for each radio providing coverage up to the 5 top performing radios in that hex, the radios get reward points. The number of reward points that in the first iteration of the HIP that we provided per hex was not different. Indoor, outdoor, we did not care. So for strong signal, as we've described it in the HIP, every radio will earn 16 reward points per hex. Outdoor radio, 16 points, indoor radio, 16 points. What we then realized, actually kind of modeling it in some of the geographies where we have a fair number of radios, actually, high concentration of radios, is that this skews what the genesis distribution of the rewards looks like very unfairly towards the outdoor radios, because the outdoor radios by definition can always cover a lot more hexes. But from the standpoint of like the macro objectives of the type of network that we're trying to build, the indoor radios oftentimes are arguably more valuable, because you actually get more people in indoor venues and coffee shops and airports and stadiums, things like that, where people deploy the radios. So it's unfair to exclusively account only for coverage versus the fact that the radio is like indoor and outdoor. So we've proposed a new model, and this is exactly the main kind of point of discussion and feedback from the community that we got. We like loaded that HIP out there, and people that have already either deployed the indoor radios or are looking to deploy indoor radios across a number of useful venues have said, well, that's not going to be worth it for me to deploy an indoor radio because I won't be earning anything. So we've adjusted the HIP, and I think quite dramatically, in fact, per the new iteration. I'm just pulling up the HIP. I'm looking right now. So the number of estimated coverage points for hex with a high signal, like with strong signal strength, an indoor radio will be able to earn 400 points. And for, adjacent hexes or the low signal strength, 100 points. This is like up from 16 points and 8 points respectively that we had in the original iteration of the HIP. So it's like almost 2 orders of magnitude increase versus the first iteration of the HIP in terms of the earning potential that the indoor radios will have.
Right. So I remember when it first came out, was it correct that the indoor radio in the first iteration of the HIP could earn up to 40 points, as in it gets 16 points in the hex where it is at, and then 4 points in all of the adjacent hex. So it's 16 plus 24, that's 40 points. And then now, so this, they earn up to 400 points in the hex that they're in.
That's correct. So they will earn 400 points in the hex that they're in and 100 points around all of the adjacent hexes.
I see. So that's a maximum of 400 plus 600 points. So that's a maximum of 1,000 points.
Exactly correct. Yes.
Got it.
We have done some modeling in certain geographies. Like, for example, we have a fairly high concentration of radios deployed in like Los Angeles metro area. And we took, all of the Los Angeles metro area. We looked at all the indoors and outdoors and everything that we have deployed there. And with the current reward point allocation, it's roughly, on average across all the radios, the indoor radios will continue earning similar to what they were during the Genesis stage when compared to the outdoor.
I have a question about the abstraction data oracle. Now that the oracle is going to go in place very soon and using a lot of the collected data points, such as the heights, the images and everything, does it make sense for installers to resubmit?
It would only make sense to resubmit it if you are changing the positioning of your radio. And so, first of all, before the rewards will go in effect, even, when and if this HIP gets passed, even inside the HIP already today, we've stated that our suggestion is that before we actually, enable this new scheme for the rewards, we make publicly available sort of like a new version of the Explorer that will allow anybody to see what their real coverage is using this modeled coverage proposal. So before submitting anything or even like trying to like tinker with any changes, the first step would be to take a look at what is the real coverage that your radio is providing. If you have an outdoor radio, find it in the 5G Explorer. We'll make that 5G Explorer very shortly available to the community. Then take a look at what the model coverage looks like for your radio. And I can tell you right away that it's not going to make a huge difference if you're going to just point at, I don't know, like 2 inches to the left, and there's not like a dramatic change in like, in terms of what's in front of the radio. So I wouldn't suggest that people bother with like ultra precise exercise of like pointing it like, let me just point it 2 inches to the left and see if I got like this 1 extra hex, or a little bit to the right and if I got 1 extra hex. There's going to be a lot of hexes that the appropriately installed radios, outdoor radios, will cover. And aside just from things like, you pointing the radio 2 inches to the right, to the left, there's going to be other factors, like, for instance, the actual like power grant that you have gotten from the spectrum access system. Because, SAS would grant you the right to radiate at different power levels. And this may change throughout, like the lifetime of the radio, on some cases, potentially even like daily basis. So like the ultra fine tuning type exercise, not recommended. But if you had your radio, pointing into a tree, or you didn't even bother to try and install it properly, because technically it didn't matter in the Genesis stage very much. And now it matters, but yeah, I would advise that like still same steps. Take a look at what the Explorer says. If you installed your radio pointing into a tree or into a ground or into a wall, the modeled coverage for your radio, it will show that basically, you're covering like 3 hexes and you're not earning anything. And if that's the situation and there's an opportunity for you to move the radio somewhere else or like turn it, I don't know, 90 degrees to the right and all of a sudden open up, to a lot of open space, then yes, I would suggest that you very much do that, because that will dramatically affect the earning potential of the radio.
Okay, that makes sense. That's very helpful for people to decide, should they stick with what they have submitted or should they resubmit?
Right.
You mentioned the Mobile Explorer. Is there a timeline when this will be live?
Yes, so we are hoping to have something available for the community this month, so before the New Year's. There's going to be probably like a somewhat crude, maybe an ugly-ish version of it, but it'll be sufficient for you to, do this very thing that I've described, to actually look, what coverage your radio provides.
But I'm assuming that in order to see what coverage my radio provides, I have to first submit and get approval for that outdoor radio in order for it to display all the data on the Explorer.
Well, I mean, so if you have a functional operational outdoor radio now, then the Outdoor Explorer will just immediately show based on like this recent submission, the last submission. Every time you install an outdoor radio, you have to get the CPI approval, right? That's just how it works. So the Explorer will show the coverage that your radio provides based on the most recent CPI approval and the current spectrum grant that your radio has. You don't have to do anything in addition if you already installed the radio. And if you installed it appropriately, if you're not just trying to, farm mobile, but you actually went and you did, to the best of your ability, a decent job installing it, chances are you don't have to do anything. You will just immediately see the real coverage, the modeled coverage that this radio is providing, and you won't even need to go and like do any tweaking.
Got it.
So Yeah.
I'm asking this because I see some people on Discord, they have this question that whether there's a way to simulate the coverage. This is similar to how there was a discovery mode feature for the IoT hotspots. So before, for the IoT hotspots, before they assert the location on chain, they can sort of play around with different positions within the room or within wherever they are to see, okay, which way is the best way to position the IoT hotspots. Is there going to be something similar for 5G?
Yes, the plan is very much to have this type of feature where you can actually basically model the coverage before committing to that being the final configuration of the radio in the 5G Explorer. So the answer is yes.
And that is also going to be available before the end of this month?
That's probably not going to be available before the end of this month, but shortly after.
Right. So when this is available, people can first simulate it, and then they can simulate a lot of different regions and placements, and then decide where they want to actually deploy the radio.
Yeah, that is exactly correct.
Okay.
Yes, and we'll probably borrow the same concepts from the IoT where you can have like a certain number of tries for free, and then you need to burn certain amount of HNT to continue modeling, because we don't want people just like forever modeling. Like there has to be some thought applied to each time you resubmit it. So
yeah. I think the community will be very happy about this feature. They're definitely going to be very excited because when the discovery mode came out, it was very, very popular for IoT hotspots.
yeah, so and here I think discovery mode is probably even more important to have, because just the nature of a band, where and how you point your radio and how you've installed it can dramatically change what your coverage really is. So absolutely, discovery mode is going to be there.
Yeah. And is it going to be the same for indoor radio?
What specifically? So kind of, yes. Except for the indoor radio, there's going to be less variability in terms of like what it actually covers, right? So there's not going to be, you can move the actual like physical location of the radio inside the building, but it's not going to matter, like just, if you point a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, like it's not going to change, because the model is always, the hex you're in, you get the maximum points, and then adjacent hexes, you get 100 points. So what's going to matter is like you can move where the hex you're in, and you can, model it that way, but there's no point to actually, change like the pitch or like the direction of the radio.
Right. You can try different hexes for the indoor radio, but there's no point in tweaking
Right.
within the hex.
Right. And moreover, like because of the way that the indoor radio reward points are proposed to be calculated now, like the only reason to move or tweak is if you have, like too many radios conflicting for coverage in your hex. So, and per HIP, we've suggested that, 5 is the number. So if you have like, you can see in the Explorer right away, if there's like 5 other radios in your hex and you're the 6th one, then just move it to a different hex, right? I don't think you really need to like do a lot of like magical modeling or planning to figure that out.
Okay. I have a question to follow up on that one. So with the proposed HIP right now, the maximum you can have inside a hex for indoor radio is 5. So let's say that there is a hex that there are 5 radios that's providing the needed coverage for the hex, and there is another hex with 5 radios in the basement. So basically it's a cluster farm. How is there any way to differentiate? Like, how do you know if the 5 radios in the hex is providing the needed coverage, or it's just somewhere in the basement?
Unfortunately, we don't know that. Right now, with the modeled coverage, there's no way to tell the difference. And one point to bring up here is that modeled coverage, as you have mentioned yourself, is kind of like the first to a series of evolutionary HIPs that we expect we will be proposing, as well as a community will be writing, to make our ability to, like reward radios in line with the usefulness of a coverage better and better. So our objective with the model coverage is not to like, we just made this one HIP and that's it, like all problems solved. It's going to be a journey with a lot of iterative steps. One thing that's clear to me is that the modeled coverage model is significantly better than the current model, which is like, basic like universal income. Like you paid X for the radio and Y is how many mobile tokens you get. So we're basically testing for nothing. We want to kind of, gradually but consistently improve and get to the nirvana state in the end. So to your question, right now, model coverage would not solve this type of problem. And this type of problem exists already today, like with the current model, right? You can just do this and we still won't be able to differentiate. But it does make it better. And what will solve it, though, is mapping. So the mappers that we've discussed before multiple times, they are not, like modeled coverage is not a substitute for mapping. It's a first step towards mapping. But mapping is what will enforce this kind of behaviors. And we will have a HIP that'll describe how mappers will work, with this modeled coverage model and how the enforcement will work. But I can tell you already right now that part of the reason, part of the logic behind the mappers is to exactly like catch this kind of scenarios.
Got it. Can you tell us more about the development on mappers and when I know it's going to be Q1 next year, but anything more and new that you can share with us? And also just in terms of like reward, how do they weigh in compared to HIP74?
Yeah, so I can give you kind of a general framework. First of all, we like when we think about coverage, we think there's kind of like two types of coverage. There's modeled coverage, and there's can be like multiple tiers to modeled coverage. The first tier is what you have seen right now, which is basically we use the obstruction data oracle, and we kind of estimate what the coverage is. There can be other important components to figuring out how to properly reward the ecosystem players depending on what and where they cover, such as, for example, like where geographically a radio is, because a radio that's covering a lot of hexes in a cornfield in whatever, like middle of nowhere, versus smaller number of hexes in downtown Manhattan, not necessarily like equal, right? So we expect that we'll build on the concept of modeled coverage by kind of growing the intelligence behind the obstruction data oracle to incorporate not just what the obstruction data is, but for example, like what are the zoning, like a geographic zoning of the location. Is it like a commercial? Is it residential? Is it like industrial or whatever? And there can be like other things, right? And you will, and there'll be just a series of HIPs that will adjust these reward points. But then the other kind of a bucket, like we have this modeled coverage bucket, the other bucket is like a verified coverage. So you have modeled coverage and it earns X. And then if your modeled coverage has also been verified, and there's multiple ways to verify the coverage that's been modeled, the verified coverage will earn more reward points. So in simplistic ways, like, imagine that I have an indoor radio that is earning whatever, like 400 model points. Now you will earn this 400 points. Now, if nobody ever verified your coverage, it'll stay 400 points. But if it's been modeled and then it's also like what's been modeled has been verified, you can get additional points, and you will get like 600 points if it's been verified. Or if it's been verified that what, your radio advertising as modeled coverage is actually untrue because you're gaming and the mapper came over and said, oh, there is no coverage there. That'll go the other way around and you will get penalized. So the first series of HIPs that we're doing, they deal with this concept of modeled coverage and making modeled coverage smart, and a parallel train that will deal with enforcing gameability and making sure that, the coverage is actually verified by third parties, such as mappers. This is this concept of verified coverage, which will enable you to, earn points or get penalties. So this is kind of how we're thinking about it in broad strokes. And mappers are like a very big, important component of, how the verified coverage is going to work. And it's not the only way to verify coverage, by the way. So for example, you don't need necessarily mappers is going to be a very efficient way to just scan the network and, basically get that verified coverage picture, but also through just usage of the network, like people with phones connecting to the radios. If I connected to your radio and I actually, did a phone call, or I opened and browsed some website through your radio, that's also a way to verify it. And there can be other ways to verify the real existence of the radio. So that's kind of the general framework that I can share about, the role of mappers and how they will work. Now, as far as the timelines are concerned, mappers today are functionally basically like ready. So we could almost already start, rolling them out to community. What's holding us back is the work that the foundation needs to do to do the basically the Solana migration, because mappers need, for mappers to work, we have this pool specifically for pool of rewards for network participants, such as mappers, that help verify the coverage. I'll describe it, right? We have 10% for mappers. And for that pool to be activated, we need the foundation to complete the Solana migration, so that the programmatic treasury can be activated. So it's really bottlenecked on that at this point.
Okay, got it. Is it correct? So I just want to make sure that I recap and got it right. So the mapper is going to account for 10% of the reward pool. And then it's up to the foundation to set up the mobile treasury. And once that is set up, the mapper is basically ready for the community.
Yes, that's a fairly accurate summary.
And then also mapper is kind of like the inspector for the model coverage. Basically, you have model coverage, and then the mapper will be there to inspect, to say, okay, are you doing it correct?
Right.
If you're doing it correctly and I mapped you, you'll get more points. If you're not doing it correctly, you will get your points deducted.
Yes, that is exactly correct. Yeah,
And
the mappers like cops in the system. Like they're going to be driving around, walking around, and they're going to be enforcing and either penalizing or boosting your points.
So it works for both indoor and outdoor radios. Not just that, okay, outdoor radios you can map, indoors you can't. It's not like that.
It works for both. Yeah.
You mentioned Solana migration, mappers and phone mappers, and also setting up the mobile treasury, and also the Helium mobile launch sometime next year. There are a lot of priorities, and all of these are really exciting, and the community is really trying to see what's going to happen next, and so that they can also plan their next move. Can you talk about their progress so far, and just in terms of the bigger picture for next year?
Well, for Nova, the biggest priority is to successfully launch Helium Mobile, because this is kind of like us sort of dog fooding the Helium network, so to speak, and trailblazing across this field of problems that potentially other service providers down the line will basically have to trailblaze following us, right? So this is kind of like the overarching biggest priority for us. Everything else is sort of is a byproduct of it, so to speak. And I think a lot of the things that you see that are coming out of it, like for instance, this even very like HIP74 and how the coverage is done is like a byproduct of that bigger goal. Because as a service provider, it's important for us that people don't just shove radios, in the basement, right? So, and we want a very fast and sort of iterative path towards useful coverage, where we as an operator on the network can actually, offload traffic off of the macro partner. How do we do that? Okay, we do the HIP74. And so like in our minds, like if we were to prioritize it, like our priority number one is to build a successful, carrier on the network, and everything else kind of just gets pulled in as a sub priority of that.
Got it. And any exciting news that you could share or reveal a little bit about Helium Mobile?
I wish I had like some like we're doing some like blah, but it's a lot of boring work behind the scenes that we are working through. And the good big reveal is that since we've announced our intent to do it in Q1, we haven't seen anything that would make us believe we need to like change the date or move the date or anything like that. I think that we're sticking to that goal, and that's what we're going to do.
That's great news. That's really great news, because everything sounds like they're on schedule, and especially given it's kind of like a really volatile crypto winter right now. So just the fact that everything is still on schedule and then we're still launching in Q1, I think that's going to be very encouraging for the community.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. Last couple questions. So since the community is still discussing HIP74, and there's also already updates on the points like you just mentioned, do you have a timeline when HIP74 will be voted on and implemented?
So I can sort of express a desire, and my desire is that it gets put up for a vote like this week. But unfortunately, I don't control it, and the foundation is basically what like is the entity that makes the decisions on when the HIPs get voted. So like I want to use this as an opportunity to lobby to the foundation that they put it up to voting like now, because we as an entity, building a carrier on the network, we need this implemented and like working as soon as possible. So I would like it to be like as soon as possible. So
got it. Yeah. And then I know you have mentioned this before, and probably in the Discord channels as well, about the phases when they're implemented. Can you maybe just gonna recap on those phases again?
The phases for sort of augmenting and like making the proof of coverage better and better, is that what you're referring to?
For HIP74, I think you mentioned before that once HIP74 is passed, there are a couple
okay,
phases.
got it. So yeah, so once HIP74 is passed, we will make the mobile explorer available to the community. Initially, probably people will just be able to at least like see the current model coverage. We won't have a discovery mode feature right away. So like my thinking is like the ideal scenario, HIP74 gets voted on, gets passed sometime, maybe, by the end of next week, let's say. I don't know, however long a foundation needs to make that happen. Once it gets passed, shortly after, we have the mobile explorer available without the discovery mode. People can start looking and discovering the radios that are actually not providing very good coverage and thinking about moving and stuff like that. Then we add discovery mode, maybe, like a week, maybe 2 weeks after the mobile explorer has been launched. From there on forward, we give the community another 2 weeks or so to just like understand what's going on and make adjustments. And after that, we turn on basically this new scheme for the rewards. So between, like, I would estimate like between now, hopefully before the end of January, we have everything HIP74 related, like actually live and functional, and the reward distribution is working as advertised in HIP74.
Well, it's all happening very soon.
I mean, it's 6 weeks, plenty of time.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's really just around the corner. So a lot of things to look forward to.
True.
Do you see on the horizon how many more HIPs? Like you said, the mapper, probably there's going to be a HIP around the mapper, and then some more HIPs, just so that to make the mobile POC more and more refined and more accurate, and to continue to reduce the possibility of farming or cheating on the 5G network. Any future HIP that you can talk about or forecast?
Yeah, definitely. So there's going to be, like I said, 2 parallel trains of HIPs that fall into the proof of coverage, like improvement of proof of coverage bucket. The first is those related to like making the modeled coverage better, and second about basically, you know, having the verified coverage more verified. Let's put it this way. So in the first bucket, I think following HIP74, there is a couple of additional HIPs that I can think of. One is related to rating the hexes vis-a-vis their like importance, and the importance is going to be a function of a couple of things. One is like the physical location, the geolocation of the hex, and whether or not, you know, it's zoned as residential or commercial, and is it in the city, is it not in the city? So framework for that. It can be you know, 1 HIP, maybe it's going to be a couple of HIPs, I'm not sure. It can be, you know, for starters, like crude things, like I said, just like publicly available zoning data can already improve dramatically. You know, what hexes are useful and which ones are not. Or it can be much more like fine-grained data. There is a lot of external information out there around, like, you know, basically the cellular network usage patterns, such as like, you know, where are people with phones tend to like congregate, and what are the density of those things. Like there's a lot of you know, third-party sources that you can tap into and use that data to kind of rate hexes as important and unimportant. It won't be anything dramatically different from what we've always advised the community about in, you know, like this umbrella description of like, you know, put radios in places with a lot of slow moving people. It's still going to be like that, but we're going to be moving away from just this simple broad statement, like, you know, many slow moving people, to like more specifics. We'll have firsthand data about like which hexes actually do have many slow moving people or have high probability of having many slow moving people. And there's going to be like a rating system for different hexes, so that not all radios are basically are going to be earning the same. It'll depend heavily on where the radio actually is. The other kind of component that goes into it is, and we've been playing around with it and probably will introduce a HIP shortly, is around enabling the carriers on the network, such as Helium Mobile and others down the line, to actually provide some input into what hexes are useful or not. So you can have sort of like universal data on, like, you know, people here, they tend, there's a lot of them and they sit and they use their phone. Okay, great. But maybe all these people are not really relevant to a particular operator, because they already have a lot of the existing coverage there, or maybe they have like tremendous underutilization of coverage there. There may be a lot of slow moving people, but they don't care about that coverage. So I think that the carrier is an important entity that needs to provide feedback into this mechanism, right? Of like, where do you want the coverage to exist? And we've been kind of playing around with a number of ideas of how to implement that, so that the carrier as an entity on the network that actually also, earns mobile today, can maybe use some of that mobile and maybe stake it to boost certain hexes. So the general idea is that like you'd have operators also carry certain voice in which hexes are useful and which ones are not. So this is like, high level HIP roadmap on the model coverage side. On the like verifying the coverage, which is like a parallel train, it's first of all the mappers, obviously, like the 10% for the mappers, but like how exactly is it going to work? Is it going to be like 10% split evenly between all the mappers out there? Is it going to be phased in gradually or not? So there needs to be a HIP for that, how the verification will start working. All right. Another HIP, I would imagine, would deal with enabling coverage verification using non-mappers, meaning just like phones, right? Or potentially verifying coverage through virtue of just using the network. So probably like a separate HIP for that. So that's kind of like high level what the thoughts are.
Right, got it. Yeah, that's very
And
interesting.
by the way, I'm just sharing all of these things. Like some of them are a little bit more baked, some of them are more kind of like ideas, but I'm hopeful that when folks listen to the podcast and like they hear directionally like what the thinking is, maybe people can kind of embrace some of that and even be proactive and propose something, right? So these are just like our ideas, but the beauty of the Helium community is that we're ideally we're not the only ones that are like proposing these ideas. So if anybody actually like listening to this monologue has any ideas spark in their head about like how certain things should be improved, please go ahead and propose a HIP or at least like make a suggestion on Discord about it. That would be very useful.
Yeah, we'll link to the 5G CBR's channel as well as the HIP74 channel, because a lot of very useful discussions and insight always happen in these two places for this HIP and 5G related content. Before we wrap this up, is there anything else you want to mention that I haven't asked or?
Well, I mean, I would like to encourage the community to make some noise in Discord channel to vote for the HIP74 as soon as possible and get it implemented as soon as possible. I know it's not ideal by any means, like it's not, the best possible scenario for, how the useful coverage should be created, but it's a huge step forward from the current state. And I think that the sooner we get it implemented, the sooner we can start thinking about like the new ideas about how to improve it along the lines of everything that I've shared here. Yeah. So that would be my kind of like, cry for help that I'd like to end with. Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely encourage the community to do so. And I think this HIP is very encouraging. I do see a lot of discussion after this HIP, and I think people are also giving it definitely some more thoughts about what kind of radios they want to buy. Is it indoor or outdoor? And if they do get indoor, where and how they're going to place it. Definitely a lot more thoughts after this HIP came out. So I think this, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Boris, for joining this episode and being a return guest. Thank you so much for your time. Until next time.
Of course. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.